Well, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. The title of the message today is In Their Own Words. In Their Own Words. And I wonder if you might sense where we're going with this when we read these verses 18 through 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Okay. Let me also, maybe at this juncture, maybe it'd be good to do it early, turn with me to Acts chapter 17. And this will give you a good sense of what we mean by this title, In Their Own Words. In Acts chapter 17, Paul, we find him speaking at the Areopagus, place where people would gather and share their various philosophies and debate and share new ideas and things like this. And this is what they did. They loved to hear things. And there, Paul is speaking to them about their idolatry. And in the process of speaking to them, he quotes from some of their well-loved philosophers and writers. And he says in verse 27, let's start in verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. No one who Paul was speaking to would have believed this. We think, oh yes, of course, this is against everything that they believe. Whichever group they were a part of, they don't believe anything he just said. And then he says that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. He actually quotes from two of their philosophers, and one of them was both also a poet, but he quotes from two of these people who they hold up as heroes and as thinkers of their, kind of their past, who they study and read, who are saying, as Paul has been saying things that are contrary to what they believe and what they practice. Paul goes back and quotes men who they study, who said, even these men in your own tradition have been saying things, perceiving these things, and telling you these things. You should know better. So in your own words, you see, this is what I mean, in their own words. Like these things that Paul says in Romans 1 about people being without excuse because they know God, you find evidence for it in things like this here in Acts 17, where you can quote to people, their pagan heroes, telling them about God and what they should believe and certain feelings and thoughts that they should have about God. And these men, were not following it. There was a call to repentance as a result. So this is what we mean in their own words. Now, the last time I spoke on Romans, we considered Paul's statement about the gospel, that he is not ashamed of it. We're thinking back now to the book of Romans, this letter that he wrote, and he's come to this place where he's talking about his being eager to preach the gospel. If you'll look with me in Romans chapter 1, verses 15 through 17, I'll just remind ourselves a little bit, spend a little time here reminding ourselves of what we have just considered. Verse 15, Paul says, so I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome, or because I'm not ashamed of the gospel, right? I'm not at all ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So we had considered Paul's statement about the gospel, that he is not ashamed of it, but rather is eager to preach it to those who are in Rome. And his confidence in the gospel and his dedication to the gospel was grounded in glorious truths about the gospel. And I just have 6 of them that I want to remind you of and kind of say in summary fashion. First, we could remind ourselves that it was given to Paul by God. And so there is tremendous certainty of the message itself, as Paul writes. Paul says he is, in Romans chapter 1, verse 1, he says that he is a slave of Christ. He was called to be an apostle, was set apart for the gospel of God. It is God's message, right? So the first reason Paul is not ashamed of the gospel is because it is the very message of God. It really wouldn't matter, I would submit to you, it wouldn't matter what the message was if you knew that God had given you specifically a message to you to give to others. You'd be proud of that thing. You'd be eager to preach it and to share it to others because it is from God, whatever the message is. And so that's the first thing. It is from God. The second reason he's so confident in the gospel and eager to share it is because it is the power of God unto salvation. As it has gone out into the world, it has proven to be, in fact, the power of God to save and to redeem and to transform people. Gentiles and Jews alike have been delivered and transformed by this gospel. So yet another reason to not be ashamed of it is whenever it's it's out of the bag and whenever you proclaim it, people's lives are changed and improved for the better. Don't be ashamed of that. And so that's the second reason. Third reason, it has accomplished that work of saving people by dealing with their sin before God and establishing a righteousness for them before God. Now that's amazing. It's one thing if I have a message that helps you, but if I have a message that helps you by dealing with the sin issue and saving your eternal soul, yet another reason to not be ashamed of this message. It's the power of God unto salvation, specifically being made right with God. And in this message, many things about the righteousness of God are revealed. The fourth reason he's not ashamed of the gospel is because the saving power of the gospel is the only saving power there is and is effective to Jews and to non-Jews alike throughout the world. Gentiles have turned in repentance away from dead idols and instead are serving the living God. Jews have understood the high demands of a holy God, perhaps for the first time, and the grave consequences of their own personal sins, and are now submitting to a salvation which replaces their earthly-minded hopes with a spiritual, joyful expectation of the kingdom of God. Fifth, this right standing with God does not require certain offerings or works to secure it. That's another reason to not be ashamed of the gospel. It doesn't require you to do all kinds of things, but rather comes solely to those who put their confidence and faith in God through Christ. That it's simple. It's easy. It doesn't require anything more of you than repentance and faith. Sixth reason he's not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for a thorough salvation. Beyond even the mere forgiveness of sin and the courtroom transaction of justification, it extends unto the fundamental change of heart and life, and even reaches into the transformation of the body and the resurrection. All of that flows to those who believe the message of the gospel concerning God's Son. It is the power of God unto salvation. Well, now that Paul has set out his eagerness to proclaim the gospel and has made his boast about it positively, he spends the next 3 chapters, or 2.5 chapters, setting forth the reason it is so urgent and needful that the way to be made right with God would be proclaimed and made known in the world. Why is it so needful that this happens? I mean, if you've got a message that can do this, that's great, but why be eager to preach it and share it in different places? Why want to go now to go and make this happen and make it known? Why not wait, for 100 years and then share it with someone? Why share it now? Why is it so needed now? Why so urgent? Why so necessary that the gospel be proclaimed now? Well, as F.F. Bruce says in his one-paragraph summary of all these chapters, these 2.5 chapters, he says it this way: the need for such a message becomes clear as we contemplate the world of mankind. Not only do we see divine retribution working itself out among pagans, whose wrong way of life is the fruit of wrong ideas about God, we see also the Jewish nation, in spite of their knowing the law of God and enjoying so many other privileges, failing to keep the law they know. In fact, all human beings, Jews and Gentiles alike, are morally bankrupt before God. No one can be pronounced righteous by God on the basis of any work or merit of his own. Well, if that's true, then we need to get this message out there. This message is vitally important, and which is what Paul goes on to do. But in these chapters, that's a good summation of what's happening. Paul is looking at both the Gentile world and the Jews and seeing that they are condemned before God. But he says more than just that, and that's maybe a fair summation, but he says a lot more things that are very important. Indeed, without this gospel, there is no salvation. In this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. His loving and faithful righteousness to save. Right? Nothing is owed to the sinner but justice. Yet God, in the pathway of His good and pure ways, did set out to promise and to perform a restoration of untold multitudes from among mankind to a great and eternal future with Him, delivering them from all that bewilders them and is against them. We learn of His judicial righteousness in the way that He saves. Sinners are saved from their fate by being forgiven of their crimes without suffering the punishment. But justice is still served by the means of a true and real substitute, one with no sin of his own. And the one who substitutes his life for them is of such worth that no righteous judge could demand any additional payment. This salvation demonstrates the judicial integrity and righteousness of God as judge of all the earth. His own standing of righteousness is applied to those who believe. Right, in the gospel, we learn that sinners receive the benefit of an effective sacrifice and also the legal standing of a representative, the God-man, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who obeyed the Father from eternity, down through to the humiliating death of His cross, obediently down and through the fierce wrath of God against sin. This Son of God is perfectly pleasing to the Father, and we are brought with Him into the Father's presence and share the same legal standing with Him forever. We receive the righteousness of God in Christ, and this also is revealed in the gospel. The righteousness of God is revealed. And also we learn of His righteousness being worked into the lives of His people, as the righteous requirement of the law is fulfilled in those who are transformed by God's Spirit and begin living a new quality of life. They are made to be more suitable image bearers of a righteous God as they become more and more Christ-like in their lives. All of that concerning the righteousness of God is glorious, but it is not so necessary or important or urgent unless you understand the true dreadfulness of the situation in the world and for those in the world who are living apart from these things. And this explains Paul's boast. It is the only antidote to a terrible state of the world, both the condition of the world, that is the wicked state that it is in, and the hopelessness under the ongoing wrath of God at work against sinners. We'll talk about that later. And also the terrible state of the world concerning the course of the world, this downward spiral the world is on, and the awaiting judgment at the end. The world is at odds with God's, and this fundamental problem is its main story and has had tremendous consequences. People are not basically good, but basically in rebellion and willfully in the grip of sin. Paul sets out then to explain all this, but he does so first by considering the world at large, and then by turning to the Jews specifically, who had great advantages, which one might think would have helped them in this area, but which did not. What Paul undertakes in Romans 1:18 all the way down through chapter 3, verse 20, is a step-by-step indictment against humanity as being under sin and judgment. With that, then, we'll consider these first three verses, Romans 1, 18, 19, and 20. Let me just read them again. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. The first thing he says here is that if we were to consider the world and look out upon the world right now, if you just sort of just have a look, we will see that it is under the wrath of God. And we will see that this is the only conclusion we can draw. You might say, well, how is that? And I want to do what I think I would be very welcome to do in this crowd, in this church. I want to quote from someone I think says it much better and more succinctly than I do, whom many of us know and love. I want to quote from Bob Jennings on this portion. He says this: how is the wrath of God revealed? It is revealed externally. We see God's wrath in the weather, the thunderstorm, the earthquake, the lightning. Who does not tremble and run for cover? We see it in history: the fall, the Genesis flood, Babel's confusion, Sodom's destruction, Israel's fall in the wilderness, the deportation of Babylon, etc. But most strongly we see God's wrath revealed in death. That is, in spiritual death, physical death, and eternal death. Death is common, but nevertheless not natural. Man is too noble and too precious to be maimed, withered, slaughtered, and finally laid in a hole with dirt thrown on his face. Sure, there are other causes for death, but ultimately all this is God's wrath on sin. Sure, the lava of a volcano kills, yet really it is the fire of the mountain that is the source of the trouble. So all misery goes back to the wrath of God on a fallen humanity. Look at the curse of the weeds, the pain of childbirth, the constant presence of disease, and the general futility of civilization. God is against the human race. We also see God's wrath internally, that is, in the conscience. The feeling of regret, remorse, and guilt are tokens of God's wrath. We see God's wrath scripturally. Josiah found the law and concluded great wrath was upon the people. We see God's wrath morally. God shows his displeasure with sin by letting us have more of our miserable sins. So God's wrath is constantly revealed. So this wrath is revealed. The first thing he says, again, is just that his wrath is being revealed. We see it all around us. The second thing Paul says is that his wrath is revealed from heaven. Right? It's revealed from heaven. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. We must understand, it's important to understand and to note, that while we typically think of heaven as maybe up there somewhere, up above us in the clouds, or maybe even beyond the clouds, it is not truly the case. Heaven is another dimension entirely, another kind of place, a spiritual place, unseen by us, but real. Heaven is the abode of God. It is the place where God presently dwells, or you might say properly belongs. It is the very throne of God and the abode of his angels. It is the place of all authority and power and dominion. It is from there that all decisions are made and all things are ordered and carried out in the world. It is the one on that throne who turns the hearts of kings and rulers and commands the winds and the waves, and before whom the mountains tremble. We're speaking of heaven. We're not wrong to think of heaven as above, especially if we think of it as being above us in order and in power and authority and all the sheer power that we might imagine could exist is found in heaven. And from there, from a place with the authority and knowledge and power to do whatsoever he decides, God's wrath is being revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. When Paul says it's revealed from heaven, it doesn't just mean it's revealed from up there. It means it's revealed from that place of all power and authority, that place from which no one can stand, from heaven. And so Paul looks out on the world and says, look at all the wrath of God out here. Look at people living under the wrath of God, deserving the wrath of God. This is what he sees. That's largely what the rest of chapter 1 is all about. It's revealed from heaven now. The next thing Paul says, he says it is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. All. There's that word all. Beloved, think of how many people think their sins are accepted from this all. Right? Well, maybe all of your sins, maybe his sin and that guy's sin, but not my sins. I won't be found out. God's wrath is for those people over there, right? Those people deserve the wrath of God, but not us. This is the way it is. God's wrath couldn't have anything to do with my circumstances or with my present misery, right? If you say something's, you might look at someone else's life and you see that they've made this decision against God and you see them suffering for it and you say, oh, that's the judgment of God. But when it's our own life, we're like, oh no. There could be no connection, right? Could be no connection between my present misery or my circumstances and some sin. How many like to amuse themselves that they got away with some sin, that no one found out, and that they won't have to pay for it? What folly. What foolishness. What a lie. What self-deception. I remember a young child sneaking into the kitchen at night, climbing up on the counter, opening the cabinet, pulling down a jar of peanut butter and digging into it with his hand, eating as much as he could. His parents woke up to the sound, walked in on him with his hand and mouth covered in peanut butter, and jar still in his hand. Rather than confess and apologize, the boy said defiantly and repeatedly, I didn't eat any peanut butter. It's like, man. And this is exactly what the person who thinks they got away with their sin is like before God. Right? Just like that. Beloved, you're doing the exact same thing every time you think, well, God doesn't care. God didn't notice. Nothing will happen. It's not true. This is not the way it is. Every sin is known. Every sin is called to account. It is amazing that when the lost of the world try to get their kids to behave for a few months, they make up lies about a certain Santa Claus who's keeping track of their every action and is carefully making a list and keeping a record of what they do. And they had better do good so they can get a better present. What a thing. That knowledge that someone's watching, that there's something at stake, constrains us into a situation in which we must behave better and as we should, rather than how we might want to if there were no consequences. As true as that is for children and for toys, it is more true for all mankind and for their lives. It's all the more true. They are held to account by God. And if they have that knowledge, then it causes them to change their action, to change their activity, if they recognize it. But what does he say? He says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. They don't want to hear that. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's keep explaining some of these things as we get there. Why should this wrath be expressed by God upon all mankind? I mean, is everyone a sinner? Are all participating in sin presently or previously? Is it the case that all are under this wrath? Why should this wrath come? Paul says two things. God's wrath is revealed against two things: ungodliness and unrighteousness. Ungodliness and unrighteousness. What do we mean? Ungodliness. Well, you might say it this way: that practice of either opposing God or else excluding Him as an object of affection, loyalty, and worship. Certainly, you'd have to say, are all sinners? If we mean ungodliness, then the answer must be yes. Certainly the masses of humanity have done this. It is a small percentage indeed in the world who ever lived lives of godliness. Right? Who lives life? I mean, look, it just doesn't happen. Excluding him as an object of their affection and loyalty and worship. Unrighteousness. With this word, Paul here is speaking of actions and attitudes which are wicked, not only because they are ungodly, but also because they violate justice and what is good and what is right. And there again, all, yes, are under this wrath. And it's not just that all people are judged for their ungodliness and their unrighteousness, but rather that all ungodliness and all unrighteousness. And it's not just all sinners are held to account, all sins will be accounted for and are accounted for. Paul is speaking here about a present revealing of the wrath of God. Something is active in the world now, not will be one day. As much as it's true is that the wrath of God is being stored up for this day of wrath, it is also true that that wrath is leaking out, like the cup has a leak, you might think, by design. And some of that wrath is poured out to wake us up and to get us to see how terrible the danger will be later. And we should prepare for it, and we should change our ways. Now, in our day, such a claim that, as Paul is making, is extremely unpopular. We are told we must be tolerant of all views. But to look out at the world and for Paul to say, look how ungodly they are. They're being judged for their ungodliness, being judged for their unrighteousness. Rather than say, oh, that's just the way they see it. They're free to be who they want to be and who they are. Right? In our day and age, this is extremely unpopular. It's always unpopular, sometimes for one reason, sometimes for another. We are told that we must be tolerant of all views, especially those that seem to us to violate our sense of what is good and what is right, what is godly and what is righteousness. Not only must we tolerate it, we are pushed to celebrate it and encourage it. Everyone, we're told, has their own ideas of right and wrong, and everyone's ideas are valid. Well, I'd say this. Maybe people do have different ideas of right and wrong. But Paul will get to that later and to why that is that some people differ as to what's right and what's wrong. And that itself is a demonstration of the judgment of God. But God is judging people for these actions, and He is right to do so, whether they agree with Him or not. The primary reason for such judgment is that people are not just acting in ungodly and unrighteous ways, but they are suppressing the truth in their unrighteousness. Again, look what Paul says in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So they exist in a state of doing continually ungodly and unrighteous acts. But they not only are doing those acts, they are directing them to a certain activity, to suppress the truth. So their unrighteousness is not just wanton unrighteousness, it is that, but it's not just random, it's not just that they just are doing unrighteous things, they are intentionally, they have a target towards their actions, to suppress this truth. Well, what truth? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Is that the great truth that the world is opposed to? What is the truth the world is opposed to? Well, he goes on then to explain. Verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. That's what they're suppressing. Their unrighteous action, their ungodly attitude, and then their unrighteousness is directed at that truth that God is and of who He is and what He's like. They're suppressing it continually. And for this, they are judged. They are actively engaged against the truth. Now, by truth here, Paul means more than what is factually true. He does not mean less than that. He doesn't mean we're not talking about things that are factually true. But truth, especially in the New Testament, is not just something to agree with, but something to be done, something to be obeyed. You can respond, you can act according to the truth, or you could sin against the truth. You could obey the truth or disobey the truth. In this case, it is the truth of God. That truth is out there in the world. Think of it. And Paul goes on to say in verse 20 that these things have been known and have been evident to people through the creation. But just understand, let's not even go to verse 20 yet. Just understand, Paul is saying God has manifested this truth in the world and people are opposed to it, whatever it is. Now we know it's about God, but just imagine there's this thing that's true in the world. It's in the middle of the town square, and no one wants it there. And so they do all they can to tear it down, to cover it up, or to pretend it's not there, to plant trees around it, do everything they can to keep people from knowing it and living it according to that. They are suppressing this truth. They don't want this to be in their face. It is to be believed. It is to be acted upon. It is to be obeyed. But mankind is working against that, disbelieving it, opposing it, and suppressing it. By their unrighteousness, they refuse to give the truth its voice, shunning it, deflecting it, covering it over, hiding it from view, ignoring it, even at times openly opposing it. Shut it down. It's not a voice they can have in the town square. Now this word suppress, just as this idea of holding it down, and there's maybe even some idea of holding it back and kind of keeping it. You might have something valuable you want to keep and you hold it back here and don't let anyone have it or know that you have it. You hide it. But it kind of has both ideas, both to press down on something and not let it come up, and then also maybe to hold it back and not let it out. And this is the idea. I don't know how, it's kind of a go-to illustration I use for this. How many of you kids ever played with a beach ball? Raise your hand. I certainly have. You've never played with a beach ball? No? Oh my. All right. So why does that work in the water? You hit it around, and what does it do? Does it sink? It floats, right? Right on top. Have you ever tried to keep it under the water? Ever get on top of it and try to hold it down? Is it easy or is it hard? Hard, right? You can do it for a little bit, and then you kind of roll off to the side, and you got to stay on top of it, and it gets tiring after a little bit, right? This is the idea. It requires a constant effort. Take that truth and put it under the water. Don't let it out. Don't let it. And then your brothers and sisters say, "Where's the beach ball?" I don't know, right? Lie, right? This is the idea. Don't let the truth surface. Don't let anyone see it. We don't want to deal with it. Well, so there's this game. A lot of times you play as a kid, maybe go to an arcade game or something, and there's these whack-a-moles where you have this club and there's like maybe 16 different holes or whatever, and something pops up and you got to hit it. Another one pops up. You see how many you can hit. You got to continually do that. You know the game I'm talking about? How many of you played that game? I've played it once. Yeah. Was it easy? No. Was it kind of fun? A little bit. Yeah. Okay. All right. A little bit tiring, right? It's a constant, continual effort to hit this thing down from all the different places where it comes. You hit it over here and it comes up over there, right? Got to go hit it here. Now it's these two places, and you go and you think you got it, and then another one pops up. And it's constantly this way with the truth of God, right? You suppress it over here and it pops up over there. You got to go here and you here and there, and it's constant. It's continuous. It's exhausting, and yet the world is continually engaged in this effort to suppress this truth. Like a lion kept in a zoo. If you're going to keep it in that zoo and you're not going to let it out, it's going to have to be planned for. You're going to have to strategize about this lion and how to keep it caged and keep us all safe from it. This is the way it is. People want to live their lives safe from the truth of God, and they plan. They do all they can to keep it from getting out. Like a stolen treasure in a walled city, the thieves will strengthen their defenses against the lawmen to come in to get the treasure back, to get the stolen goods. They will do all they can. Let's turn with me to a couple passages here just to see this. John chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. John chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light lest his deeds should be exposed. You see? There's light there in the world, but they don't come to it. Why? Well, I don't want my deeds exposed. It's not that they didn't know there was light. They chose to live in the darkness. Does that make sense? That's what we mean. There's an example of suppressing the truth. You say, well, how is that really suppressing it? Well, suppose I'm a parent of 3 children and I hate the truth. And the light comes. I love the darkness. What do? I stay away from the darkness. Do I let my children come see the light? No, I keep them from it too. We are suppressing the light, suppressing the truth, right? Doing all we can to keep it from having its voice. A very good example, turn with me to Psalm chapter 10. This is probably my favorite example in all the Bible of this. It seems so clear. Psalms chapter 10. Now we're going to look at a wicked person. It says the wicked, right? Verse 2, in arrogance the wicked hotly pursue the poor. So we're talking about the wicked. We're going to get a glimpse of the wicked person before their sin while they're planning it, during their sin while they're performing it, and after their sin while they're reminded of it. And in all 3 instances, we will see them suppressing the truth about God. Okay, so before their sin. In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes that they have devised. Here it says, for the wicked boasts of the desires of his soul, and the one greedy for gain curses and renounces the Lord. Why would you have to curse and renounce the Lord if you're greedy for gain? Just think of that for a moment. Think about what's happening inside the heart of the wicked man when he's greedy for gain. He wants these things, and in his planning about them, as he's scheming, he's cursing God. Why? Because God has forbid him to do those things and to care about those things in that way and to make the plans he's going to make. So before he even does it, he's cursing God. In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there's no God, there's no God, there's no God, there's no God, there's no God. His ways prosper at all times. So he's succeeding in his plans. But it says, but your judgments are on high, out of his sight. Where does that sound like they are? In heaven. As for all his foes, he puffs at them. And then now, verses 6 and following here for a little bit, during his sin. He says in his heart, I shall not be moved. Throughout all generations, I shall not meet adversity. He's dealing with his conscience here again. His mouth is filled with cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue are mischief and iniquity. He sits in ambush in the villages, in the hiding places. He murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in his thicket. He lurks that he may seize the poor. He seizes the poor when he draws him into his net. That is during, and he's saying, I won't be moved. Before he said, there's no God, and now he's saying, well, I won't be moved. Nothing's going to happen to me. I can act like this with impunity. Nothing will befall me. No consequences. No one to answer to. And then after, verse 10, the helpless are crushed, sink down, and fall by his might. What does that wicked person say then? He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He'll never see it. Didn't he just say earlier when he was planning it, there is no God? And now afterward he's saying, well, he forgot. It's amazing. Before, during, and after, this wicked man is constantly dealing with the fact that he's going to be held to account for the things that he loves and the things that he pursues and the way he treats people and his lack of living for God and judgment upon the things that he's done. It's amazing. This is what's going on in the heart of the wicked. He's wrestling with God and his conscience about past, present, and future sins. It's incredible. This is the way it is. Suppressing this truth every time when he's scheming. I don't think there even is a God. While he's doing it, I can keep on like this. There's not going to be any God. God's not going to call me to account. I'm going to press on the way I am. Nothing can stand against me. And then afterward, well, he probably forgot. It's probably not that big a deal. Other people have done worse, right? No big problem. What a thing. This is the way it is. Well, back to Romans chapter 1. We've finished, I believe, here with verse 18. Let's go on to verses 19 and 20. Notice the way the things are worded here. Paul had said in verses 16 and 17 why he was not ashamed of the gospel. And he's talked about it being the power of God for salvation. In it is revealed the righteousness of God as being from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And then he gives this other reason in verse 18, verse 1, for, because, more logic, more explanation for why he's not ashamed of the gospel. Because I'm not ashamed of the gospel, which is the revelation of the righteousness of God, because the wrath of God is presently now being revealed throughout the whole world against men who suppress the truth. And verse 19 comes then to explain and reassert Paul's statement that they are suppressing the truth. It's almost like you're almost incredulous. Suppressing the truth, really? And Paul just looks at you and says, yes. He says, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. And you say, oh, he meant to say that, and he means it. Like, yes, they're suppressing the truth. What do you mean they're suppressing the truth? Well, because what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. You know, the agnostic, that's if someone is agnostic, some of you kids certainly probably don't know, that's the idea that anyone, if their belief, or at least their stated belief, if what they tell you is, I think maybe there could be a God, but I'm not sure. And if there is a God, we probably can't know him because he would be such a higher being than we are. He's so different than us that we couldn't really know anything about him. That's the position of an agnostic. Well, that flies in the face of what Paul says here. Paul says, what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Now, I could listen to an agnostic and say, well, if God was real, we couldn't know him like perfectly because he's such a unique being. I would say, well, that's probably true. I mean, I'm probably never going to know all that there is to know about God. Like, that's what eternity is for. There's always another, you might say, day in eternity. There's more to learn. Agreed. No problem. No argument there. But when the agnostic says, therefore we can't know anything about him, what he's really like, I say, well, Paul says that we can know certain things about God. And in Genesis, we were made in such a way to reflect certain things about God, to be in his image and to be in communion with him. There's some sort of knowledge we can have about him. And God says those things that can be known about God are plain to them. And so then I have to look at that agnostic and say, actually, you're lying. You do know things about God. You know things about the true God. Not just a God somewhere, but the true God. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Not only do they know about God, they've been told by God about God. Does that make sense? God is the one who's revealed these things to them. It's amazing. It's not just that they failed to read that chapter in the book. God is rather whispering to them about himself throughout their life. God is the one who's sharing it with them. What a thing. God has revealed himself to us. And we are therefore accountable for what he has told us. Verse 20 then seeks to demonstrate why mankind is rightly under God's wrath for suppressing this truth. What does he say? For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Right? So we conclude with they are without excuse. Why is it they're without excuse? Well, we read in verse 19 that God had been showing them these things. How did he show them these things? Well, this is what verse 20 is about. For his invisible attributes. Now, what are his invisible attributes? Well, there are lots of, it's weird to call them invisible attributes in a sense. Like it's an invisible attribute. Like you would think, like if I was invisible, I would probably call that one of my attributes, invisibility, right? Like we would say, oh, that's awesome. You have that power, right? Like, what do you mean invisible attributes? Well, what we mean is those attributes about God that we don't see. Right? God himself is a spirit. What are his attributes? These invisible attributes. It's amazing because it says, what can be known about God is plain to them, but God has shown it to them. What has He shown to them? When I say, "Hey, let me show you something," don't you understand that you have to open your eyes and see something visible? But what we are reading is that God has shown invisible attributes. So something that cannot be physically seen is still perceived and made known to us. These certain qualities of God, His righteousness, His eternal power, right? Those kinds of things are known about God because God speaks them to us, declares them to us, shows them to us, demonstrates them. And He even says His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So it's an indirect showing. It's as if God says, look here at this mountain. Or we could say better, we could all agree with this. Certainly we've all seen the stars. Look at these stars. Think about them. What is it telling you? Well, they're declaring the glory of God. This is what's happening. And in the thing you see, it is obvious and it is, Paul says, clearly perceived by everyone who God is. There's a true God. Not only that He's eternal and He's powerful, but even it says His divine nature. Now, if you're reading the King James, it says His Godhead. And it's like, Godhead, like the Trinity specifically? That's not the word. It's kind of a bad translation. The word is just, it has to do with like His godness. And which is why most modern translations translate it divine attributes, His divine nature, His divine attributes. What things are true about Him? How should we understand these things? What is clearly perceived? Well, first of all, let's look at this eternal power. If there's anything that to me describes what God would be like, what we mean when we say, all this God made everything. We're talking about one who is eternal and one who has the power to create. And I think when Paul says that men are judged for their ungodliness, it has to do with that. It's connected to this thing about His eternal power. That there is, in a sense, men aren't walking around thanking their Creator all the time for the things they receive from Him. Ungodliness. They're not adoring Him, loving Him, worshiping Him as God, as the benefactor to their lives. Right? Whether it be through your philosophy that says, I think maybe all things came about in this way, or through whatever it may be, whatever your ideas are, they're wrong-headed in this sense. They are ungodly. They don't acknowledge the eternal power of God. Now, let's just, let me keep going. So then, this other aspect of His divine nature. So His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power, and then His divine nature. And I think this one functions along the lines of unrighteousness. They're condemned for their unrighteousness. That is a sin against His divine nature. I think by divine nature, Paul has to do with the nature of divinity. Like not just that He is. What do we mean about this divine one? How could looking at the stars teach you certain things are wrong? How could just living in this world teach you certain things are wrong? All men are in agreement. There's some things we all know are wrong. Where do we learn that from? We learned it from existing in this world, where there's a right and wrong that's woven in the very fabric of our existence in the world that God created. His divine nature is evident. Everyone knows certain sins deserve the judgment of God. Everyone knows they're morally accountable to this divine one. And they know certain sins which they've committed that they are not eager to stand before Him about. And this is what we mean. So this is the way I understand His eternal power and divine nature, as Paul writes it there. Regardless of how we divide these things up and which things we put into what bucket, in terms of our accountability before God, which things I say, well, that's more on the eternal power side and this is more on the divine nature side. But regardless of any of that and how you divide it, certain things are just true. These things are known by people and they are accountable to God for what they know. I want to turn to 3 passages in Acts, which I think go a long, long ways to explaining what we're talking about here. Let's first go to Acts chapter 28. So you might not even have to turn the page. Acts chapter 28 and verse 4 is the main verse we're going to look at, but let's start with verse 1. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." Think of that. That was their idea. We can go on and see that they were obviously proven wrong and wrong-headed in that. But just the fact that here are the people, and someone is shipwrecked. He survives the shipwreck, and you think, man, they're already seeing the shipwreck and thinking, oh man, I wonder if somebody's under the judgment of God. Then they have this fire. These people are kind to them. And they have this fire, and out of the fire jumps a snake, a viper, a poisonous snake, and bites a man. And they say, that guy, I bet he was a murderer. Justice is not going to let him live. He got out. He thought he escaped over here, but justice is pursuing him. And that murderer, they didn't say a sinner, they said a murderer. They assumed he was a murderer. Now, I just mean to say that people know this. Where are they getting these ideas? God has shown it to them. Murderers deserve death. God has shown it to them. Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14. You want another example of people suppressing the truth? Now, Acts chapter 14, verse 8. Now at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. Now, just initially you'd think, okay, these people were in darkness, this thing happened, and they're responding as people in darkness would, in their ignorance, but they're honoring these men. What's so bad? Well, they barely restrained them, even after reasoning with them in this way. These men are living in darkness. They're calling these men God. They're making all the wrong conclusions. But look, the story goes on. They were just about ready to offer these men sacrifices as gods. And now in verse 19, but Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city. We forget about that part of it. They're going to say, oh, this is Zeus and Hermes. These are gods. And then maybe people come and say, hey, they got this message. They're causing trouble. Oh, man, kill them. It's like, what are you talking about? They've never seen anything like this in their life. They never heard of anything like this, kind of a miracle happening. They assume these men must be gods. And rather, Paul is saying, we have a message from God to you to repent from all your wickedness and all your wrong ideas and serve Him. He's the one all your life long who's been giving you these things and satisfying your heart. Every good thing you've ever received has been from Him. Serve Him. And they say, die. It's incredible. That's the response? Suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It's terribly sad to see this kind of thing. When you hear this, don't you think, what will God do to these people for trying to kill these messengers? The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness from men. What else? Acts chapter 17, just a couple chapters later. Let's read there. Acts chapter 17, reading probably about half the chapter, a little more than half the chapter, verses 16 through 34. We're not going to try to explain all of it, but we're going to zero in on those things which are relevant for us here. We're thinking again about people knowing the eternal power and divine nature of God and yet not worshiping Him. Listen to this. And again, this is where we read from earlier when we opened the message, but we are here again reading a larger portion. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took hold of him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is He served by human hands, as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything, and He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, in the hope that they might feel their way toward Him and find Him. Yet He's actually not far from each one of us, for in Him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed His offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent, because He has fixed a day on which He will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom He has appointed. And of this He has given assurance to all by raising Him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their midst. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. There was one of these guys from the Areopagus who came and became a believer. The rest of them, what did they do? They mocked. Paul there comes to them. I mean, it's amazing to think Dionysius, well, here he was, this Areopagite. He was just one of these guys, always listening to these philosophies and debating things, hearing new teachings, and Paul comes and he's converted. He abandons it all. As Paul's reasoning here, he's saying, that's right. We do acknowledge, I mean, imagine they have all these various gods they have statues for. And as Paul walks along the way, you find one other one, who knows what the shape was in, but it's just probably an empty, nothing on top of the pedestal, to an unknown God. Right? They're living all their lives trying to please this God or that God or whatever, do all these things. Some say, well, I don't know if that God's real, but I believe in this God, and I believe in this God. And, I know these three gods are real, but I'm a devotee of this one because even though that God has these powers, this one has this power, and I'm going to serve him, and that's what we're going to live. That was life. But they all said, can you imagine the meeting? I think we should build a statue to an unknown God. An unknown God? Who's ever heard of such a thing as an unknown God? Why would you serve an unknown God? Well, it seems to me, while there's something to be said for all of these various gods, we're missing something. It doesn't quite match what there's another God. Or if we're serving this one and that one, I have this aching feeling that I'm missing one. That we're not doing there's something left undone. My conscience isn't clean. I still feel like there's some other power that could overdo this God that supposedly has this power. I'm going to serve an unknown God. Paul says, what you serve is unknown, I declare to you. And who does he say this unknown God is? It's the only God that is, the one who made everything. And then a lot of the things that they believe, well, this God has this power, and this God did this, and this God did that. He just says, no, it's just this God did all those things. It's not as if he's just saying, you're right, you might be right about these other gods, but there's this other one, let me tell you about him. He's saying all this is wrong. The only God that is the one you don't know. And I'm going to tell you all about him. And that you're accountable to him. And they mock him. It's incredible. He quotes their own scholars, their own men, and they ignore it. You see? It doesn't matter where the witness comes from, even from their own wise men, they reject it still. It doesn't matter. They were offering worship and thanksgiving to all the wrong things. They knew they were morally accountable. I mean, think about the world itself. Just the court. We say this message. I say the title of the message is "In Their Own Words." We're reading some of their own words here. Men understand these things. They just don't want to believe them. Everyone knows certain sins deserve the judgment of God. We saw that in Acts 28. And so, what does all the world do? They all give their sacrifices to their various gods, try to appease their conscience and earn favor and curry favor in spite of their misdeeds of the past. Everyone. They're all dealing with it. Atheists today would say, well, I think it just matters all that is. It's just, that's all there is. It's like, really? Where do we get all this order? Where do you go about believing that some thoughts are higher than other thoughts? That there's such a thing as truth? Life, where did life come from? Life comes from life. We've never seen it happen any other way. And these scientists who say they're all about observing things and just telling you what they observe. And they say, I think life came from non-life. Utter fools, right? It's unbelievable. Matter created itself, right? Gravity created, the laws of gravity created gravity. It's like, what are you talking about? It's impossible. Men are reduced to utter foolishness. Men who are otherwise very logical throw logic out the window. Whatever is necessary, whatever they got to do to whack that mole, however they got to twist and contort their body to hold that ball down, right? However much preparation they have to do to keep the lion caged, they'll do it. Suppress that truth. Don't let it out. And so they are without excuse. All of this leads us to this point, right? They are without excuse. There's no such thing as the ignorant, secluded tribe on the island who just doesn't know God. They know God. God has shown things to them. They have clearly perceived these things. They have turned to darkness instead. There's no such thing as the noble savage. There's no such thing as the fair-minded atheist. Now, God may cause these people to turn, bring them to a place of fair-mindedness before they become full-on believers. He may cause them to come to a place of seeking, of groping in the dark, that they might finally come to the light. That happens. But such people, in their darkness, are not in darkness as victims, but as willful residents of the dark. They want to be there. They don't want to be in the light. They suppress the truth. And this is the beginning of what Paul lays out about humanity. That fundamentally, people are at odds with God because they suppress the truth about Him that they know. And so God's wrath is revealed. And we're going to see in the weeks ahead how that wrath is revealed. The effect that that wrath has. Initially it just starts out, look, the wrath of God is revealed and it is warranted. And then we're going to see what happens. The many ways it's poured out upon men. The many ways you can look out on the world and see that wrath at work. And it is terrifying. And is meant to leave us to the place where we say, is there a remedy? Is there something that can be done? And that's where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of this gospel. Did you forget about this gospel over here? This is what I'm sharing. This is what I came to bring. This is good news. That's how these chapters function. Well, beloved, are there questions or comments?